Before we begin, if you enjoy falling asleep to forgotten corners of history, quiet ruins, stories that were never meant to be remembered, subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments, what time is it where you are? Where in the world are you listening from tonight? Your quiet presence helps keep these hidden histories alive. Now, let's drift back to what was buried under the nursery floors of ancient palaces. Asterisk at first glance. The Palace of Mari looked like every other royal city that once sat along the Euphrates, grand, sun-blasted, and nearly gone. Located in modern-day Syria, Mari was one of the great administrative capitals of the 18th century BCE, a city of scribes and kings, and one of the best documented palatial complexes of the Bronze Age. It had more than 300 rooms. It had painted walls, massive archives, ritual chambers, and oddly, it had nurseries. But beneath the floors of those nurseries, archaeologists found something else. They found silence in the shape of small bones, rows of infant burials, tiny skulls, fragile ribs, urns holding the ash of the very young. This is not a horror story, it's a history, and it's slow, okay? And like much of ancient history, it's not what's above ground that reveals the truth, okay? It's what's quietly buried underfoot. The nursery rooms of the Mari Palace weren't decorative additions. They were functional, state-controlled spaces where the youngest members of the royal line were kept, heirs, daughters, stillborns, all. The rooms were usually located near women's quarters, closer to warmth and away from court politics. They often had their own small hearths and cooling channels. The idea was to control the environment, temperature, humidity, noise, but no amount of architecture could protect them. Infant mortality in the Bronze Age, even in palaces, was astonishingly high. Nearly 1 in 3 babies died before reaching their first birthday, okay? And so, over time, the palace itself became a layered tomb. Archaeologists working at Mari in the 1930s, under André Perret, documented numerous small burial jars beneath plastered floors, especially near the women's apartments and in the corners of child-occupied chambers. They weren't just discarded, they were placed with care. Some were wrapped, some contained toys, rattles, even beads. Some had clay seals marked with the signs of particular gods, especially Dagon and Nursery, deities linked with life and fertility. And so, you must ask, why bury infants under floors? In ancient Mesopotamia, and especially in Mari, the dead were not always separated from the living. For infants, it was believed they had not fully entered the realm of personhood. Their burial under domestic floors, especially under cradles or near doorways, was both symbolic and practical. Symbolic in that the child never left the world of the home, and practical in that these burials were thought to offer protection, perhaps even blessings for future children. But protection from what? Some believe these burials were part of a ritual appeasement, a way of calming the souls of infants who died too soon. Others argue it was part of a broader fertility ritual. The more children buried underfoot, the more future children might survive. It's a terrible calculus, but in a world where medical care was mostly prayers and poultices, people used whatever logic they had. The jars themselves varied. Some were made of coarse red clay, others of painted ceramic. The richer the family, the finer the container. But death didn't always obey status. Even royal infants were not exempt from the unseen dangers of disease, infection, or birth gone wrong. Sometimes the jars held 2 children. Sometimes they were sealed with pitch and gypsum, keeping the soul inside, or perhaps keeping something else out. These were not cemeteries in the modern sense. There were no names carved, no records kept. But one thing was constant: the placement, always under rooms where the living passed, always close to daily life. The Palace of Mari had other secrets. Thousands of cuneiform tablets lined its archives, messages between kings, reports on grain, dreams of omens interpreted by scribes. One letter from a palace midwife to the queen simply states, "The second cry did not come." That phrase, "the second cry," became something of a symbol in Mari's archaeology. The first cry was birth, the second, survival. If a baby cried a second time, they had likely lived beyond the fragile first hour, but many never did. What's striking is the institutional calm with which this was handled. The palace had procedures. Midwives were trained. Burial jars were prepared. Offerings, small ones, were made. Occasionally, a mother's bracelet or a father's ring would be placed in the jar, a symbol, not of wealth, but of presence. By the 18th century BCE, the Palace of Mari had grown into a bureaucratic machine. But beneath the stone thresholds of its halls, the cracks of life and death ran quietly through the clay. And nowhere was this more quietly felt than beneath the nursery floors. The palace itself burned in the 1750s BCE, likely under Hammurabi's conquest. But when archaeologists began excavating nearly 4,000 years later, they noted something strange. The infant. Jars were untouched. Walls had crumbled. Tablets had been smashed. Paintings had faded. But the small burial jars, cradled in soil, pressed into corners, remained exactly where they were left. Did anyone remember them? Or did time forget, as time always does? And what does it mean? That a place built for power, glory, and administration chose to hide its youngest, most vulnerable stories beneath its feet. That's where we begin. A palace that wept through walls and sang only in the silence of buried jars. Asterisk, the dead in Mari were not placed on hills or behind gates. They remained within, inside the house, within the palace walls, and sometimes underfoot, especially the small ones. As archaeologists traced the layout of the palace, they noticed a pattern in nearly every major residence attached to the royal family or high-status officials. There were infant burials, buried shallow, just beneath the plaster flooring. But what startled them most was not their location. It was the deliberate placement. Each jar was positioned just beneath the space where people walked daily. Not in gardens, not in distant crypts, but in the very center of movement, beneath doorways, hearths, courtyards, and often in what seemed to be nursery rooms. One excavation trench revealed 3 such jars arranged like a triangle. Each contained the remains of a very young child, one stillborn, one infant estimated at 6 months, and another around 2 years old. All were buried at slightly different times, separated by maybe a year. But what made the find chilling was this. Beside one jar, a polished stone carved into the shape of a rattle, and beside another, a flat seal bearing the image of a breastfeeding goddess. Were they siblings? Was this a private memorial or a ritualized sequence? Archaeologists still do not know. But the careful grouping suggested something more than mere convenience. It hinted at remembrance in ancient Mesopotamia. Memory wasn't just emotional, it was spiritual and political. The dead lived on through ritual, offering, name, and placement. And for children who had not yet left a mark in society, their bodies had to be integrated into the space itself. Otherwise, their souls would wander. Sumerian texts, which predate Mari but deeply influenced its culture, describe infant spirits as the most restless. Without proper burial or prayers, they became a demu, a kind of ghost without peace. And so, burying an infant beneath a living space was not just tender, it was also protective. The floor became a seal, the jar became a tomb, and a talisman. Many of these burials included bits of textile, some linen, others wool, tightly packed around the remains. This slowed decomposition and preserved the contents, but it also mimicked swaddling. Even in death, the infant remained wrapped. Other jars contained small trinkets, a blue bead, a copper pin, a chip of painted ceramic, teas weren't always valuable, but they were personal, and in a society where burial reflected belief, these gestures mattered. One room in Mari was believed to be a child care chamber based on its layout. It had a low hearth, unusually small benches, and wide open areas, perhaps for play or nursing. Beneath that room alone, 7 infant burials were discovered. 7. One had its jar sealed with a stamp impression of the moon god Sin. Another with a broken plaque of Ishtar, goddess of love, war, and also fertility. It's easy to forget that royal palaces were homes. Behind the murals, past the great hallways and reception chambers, there were mothers, rocking children, wet nurses, warming goat's milk, and small babies who never made it past their first winter, and the floors held their stories. And yet, despite all this intimate death, nothing in the royal archives speaks directly of mourning. There is no eulogy, no lamentation, no inscription to the lost infants. The scribes wrote of harvests and rainfall, war and weddings, but not of babies who stopped breathing before the crown could be sized for their heads. That silence is one of the loudest things Mari left behind. Historians believe this absence in record keeping was not accidental. In Mesopotamian ideology, a child only became a full legal person after surviving a naming ritual, usually on the 7th or 10th day. Before that, they were still considered in between. Sacred, yes, but also undefined. Perhaps that is why the burial jars were placed quietly underfoot, to keep the undefined close, to fold the unknown back into the earth of the home. There is a kind of grief in that. There is also a kind of control. Asterisk. The Palace of Mari, like most Mesopotamian centers, was obsessed with order, physical, cosmic, and administrative. Every tablet in its archive was labeled, every boundary stone described in duplicate, and yet it accepted a chaos beneath its feet. Bones, ash, the tiny curvature of ribs, no longer breathing, in one chamber. A burial jar held something unexpected, a miniature cup made of bronze, etched with animals. A drinking vessel far too small for practical use, likely ceremonial, likely buried with a child who had been weaned, perhaps was meant for the journey into death, symbolic feeding for the afterlife, or perhaps it was all the family could give. Another chamber contained a burial that was clearly royal. The jar was more ornate. Inside, the remains were carefully arranged with signs of embalming, a rare practice for infants. And with them, a strip of cuneiform etched on a clay roll, reading, "Beloved, returned." Tet phrase. Just that. No name. And so the question arises again. How many of these babies had names? How many were royal and how many were servant-born? How many were loved deeply and how many were born only to die in silence? The answers may be sealed forever beneath a palace that now lies in ruin, picked apart by sand, war, and time. But the bones remain, and the jars remain, and the floors, though cracked and distant, still remember where every tiny body was placed. And if memory is architecture, then Mary's walls are built not just of brick and plaster, but of the lives that never left its rooms. The living stepped above them. They still do. And yet, we ask, when a kingdom hides its grief beneath its floors, what else does it bury? Asterisk. When the Palace of Mari fell in the 18th century BCE, it didn't fall quietly. The collapse came during the reign of Zimralim, the last great ruler of the city. After a brief alliance with Hammurabi of Babylon, dissolved into fire and betrayal, the archives were burned, the murals cracked, and yet, amid the ash and ruin, the jars remained. The infants buried beneath the nursery floors survived the destruction of their palace. They were already beyond harm. This is where our story must linger, not at the moment of political downfall, but beneath it, quite literally, because As walls crumbled and kings lost crowns, the bones of unnamed children remained in place, sealed in clay and tucked beneath the feet of those who once hoped they'd grow. The archaeologists who uncovered these burial sites in the 1930s and 40s rarely included them in their early reports. It was considered too mundane, too domestic, or perhaps too uncomfortable. Ancient palaces were meant to show grandeur, not grief. Columns and courtyards, not cribs and coffins. But history, like dust, accumulates in layers. And it's often in the quietest corners, under hearthstones, behind nursery doors, where the deepest truths settle. There is evidence that some of these burials became focal points for ritual. One floor showed signs of repeated anointing bitumen traces layered atop the plaster, possibly from oil libations poured during anniversary rites. Another burial site had been reopened, not looted, but visited. The jar lid had been carefully removed, then resealed with fresh clay, as if someone had checked not to steal, but to remember. These weren't graves in the traditional sense. They were anchors, physical points around which emotion and belief gathered, invisible to most, but central to those who lived above them. And while the city's scribes wrote daily of war treaties and livestock counts, no line remains that mentions the names of these children. There are no poems, no funeral songs etched in clay, but their presence remains more visceral than any tablet. Their absence was made permanent by being embedded in the place they were born. Some modern historians, like Pietra Stinkler and Jean-Marie Durand, have suggested that such infant burials under household floors may have been attempts to keep the spirit within the family, not for fear of haunting, but for continuity. An infant who died might still carry weight in the afterlife. Placing them within the domestic space preserved a kind of ancestral tether, a hope that they might return, if not in body, then in fate, that another birth might go better, that one child's death might ensure another's survival. It's a pattern seen elsewhere too, in Ebla, in Ugarit, in smaller Mesopotamian villages whose names never made it into the myths. A tiny rattle here, a carved shell bead there. It's traces of mourning in the folds of domestic life. And so we ask again, when these children were placed beneath the floors, were they forgotten? Or were they always there, just out of reach? It's tempting to imagine a mother returning each day to kneel quietly above a particular tile, whispering a name. But that image, soft as it is not guaranteed. Some of these burials were pragmatic, swift, and personal in the palace's clinical pursuit of order. Even mourning had its protocols, but there's still room for something more human in one chamber. A burial jar was found alongside a second container, not a tomb, but a jar filled with dried flower remains. Ancient pollen studies confirmed the presence of myrtle, date blossom, and tamarisk, all rare and fragrant. It was, essentially, a floral offering. The bouquet had been placed beside the infant burial and buried with it. Not standard, not official, just human. Grief finds its way into every system, even palatial ones. In the present day, Mari lies in ruin. The palace's remains are periodically uncovered, documented, and reburied for preservation. Tourists are rare. Security is tight, and many of the infant burials are once again sealed under earth, their jars undisturbed, their tiny occupants finally safe from the hands of curiosity. But the questions remain. What did it mean to grow up, or fail to, in a palace where even death was managed like grain? What did the children buried under the nursery floors mean to those who walked above them, and in a kingdom where scribes documented even the moon's reflections on water? Why did no one write the names of these children? Perhaps because the names were whispered, not written. Perhaps because the memory was kept in footsteps, not in script. Or perhaps, and this is most likely, they were not considered worthy of record, and that may be the truest tragedy, that these lives small as they were, left no trace in the systems of power, and yet left entire shadows across the stone. The palace of Mari, in all its splendor, was not immune to the oldest, most persistent sorrow of all, the loss of a child. And so, today, when scholars study the site, they examine more than political intrigue or royal alliances. They look at bone structure, jar composition, pollen traces, boring things, slow things, forgotten things, but real. And if there is a lesson to carry from beneath the nursery floors of Mari, it is this: the most enduring history is not carved in stone. It is buried quietly in the dust, where someone once cried. Someone once wrapped a tiny cloth around a smaller body, okay? And someone, perhaps no one, walked away, leaving the floor smooth and silent. And now we know to listen more carefully. When the floor doesn't creak, it may be whispering. In the ancient city of Lagash, long before Babylon was a whisper, and before Nineveh had its towers, there stood a structure not meant for worship, but for waiting. A long room of brick and thatch, perfumed with oils and filled with the dull murmur of women pacing, midwives, servants, wet nurses, and the occasional priestess. This was not a temple, nor a home. It was something in between, a birthing room, and, beneath its woven red mats, archaeologists uncovered something unexpected: layers of ritual bones, stacked neatly along one wall, embedded into shallow shelves molded from clay and silt. Each shelf was different, some lined with broken spindle, whorls, or copper blades, others marked by fire. They were not tombs, they were not sacrifices, they were something else. These were altars, built not from stone, but from the remains of women who died giving life. This is not metaphor. This is not poetry. This is an architectural fact. Between 2350 and 2150 BCE, in the sacred district of Lagash, a prominent Sumerian city located in what is now southeastern Iraq, there stood a complex of buildings that served the city's upper classes. Among them, a midwifery chamber. In its back rooms, a quiet corridor no wider than 2 paces, where bones were found embedded in mud brick alcoves, humerus, tibia, fragments of pelvis, all female. There was no grave pit, no burial jar, no sign of haste. The bones were deliberately placed, cleaned, dried, and packed into rectangular compartments, arranged not like a tomb, but like storage, shelves of memory, bone as ledger. The room itself told no stories, but the wall spoke volumes. Scholars were perplexed. Why bones here? Why women's bones? And why so intentionally presented in a chamber associated with childbirth? A theory emerged. In Sumerian cosmology, the boundary between life and death was fluid, especially for women. Midwives were more than helpers. They were ritual specialists, guardians of thresholds. They anointed, they prayed, they cut, and sometimes they buried. It's believed that when a mother died in childbirth, a tragically common occurrence, her body, or parts of it, were preserved within the walls of the birthing space. It's not as punishment, but as protection. Her remains were thought to guard future mothers, to witness, to bless, and perhaps to warn. There are Sumerian texts that mention the mothers before. Vague but powerful phrase, often invoked in incantations against birthing demons, especially Lamashth, a feared female spirit blamed for miscarriages and infant deaths. To guard against her, midwives would draw symbols on the walls, bury charms under bedding, and in some rare cases, incorporate bones into the very architecture of their rooms. Bone altars, shelves of grief, turned into tools, a record not kept in ink, but in calcium and silence. Some bones were marked with pigment, deep red from iron oxide, or black from soot. Others were bound in thin cord, as if to hold them together long after the body had gone. And one unearthed in 1987 during excavations near the presumed sacred district. bore the tiny carving of a handprint on its surface, not painted, carved. A child's hand, likely impressed into wet clay, then hardened and stored with the rest. Who was that child? Was it a survivor or a twin who never cried? The women who tended these rooms, royal midwives and temple nurses, were among the few literate women in the region. Their roles were officially recognized. Some held seals, others land grants. They were paid in grain, beer, and cloth. Hey, and yet, their records say almost nothing about these bone shelves. Was it a secret tradition, or just too ordinary to mention? One preserved tablet from Lagash refers obliquely to placing the honored into the chamber wall. Another speaks of restoring strength through those who labored. It's unclear if these are euphemisms or literal references to what we now suspect that the walls themselves were made into memory. It wasn't just in Lagash. A similar chamber was found in nearby Gursu, where a birthing bench made of fired clay had small cavities along its edge. In those cavities were bone fragments, each smeared with resin, possibly to seal, possibly to protect, possibly just because we do not know if the mothers whose bones, these had names. We do not know if they agreed, but their bones remained. Long after the scribes lost their pens and the priests lost their hymns, there is something intimate, unsettling about turning the body of the dead into architecture for the living. It speaks to a worldview where the line between corpse and relic, between tragedy and tool, was thin. In our world, we separate. In theirs, they combined, and so the midwives built altars, quietly, not on mountains, not in temples, but in the corners of rooms where mothers screamed, and in the silence after, they placed what was left into the wall, one bone at a time. This was not punishment. It was not horror. It was hope, a crude and desperate hope that the next birth not end the same way, that something could be learned, that bone could remember what blood could not. So we ask, when a wall is built from loss, does it hold us up or weigh us down? And when a child is born beside a bone, do they carry that weight? Castorisk, in the sacred records of Lagash, the names of kings were etched with pride, and the deeds of generals were listed with care. The names of the women who crouched over straw floors, catching slippery new life with trembling hands. Those were rarely recorded, and yet they shaped the city in quieter ways. Their presence was not in monuments, but in margins, in the prayer scars on walls, in the grooves worn into clay benches, and in the bone shelves pressed into the backs of birth rooms. The midwives of Lagash were not servants. They were skilled, selected, sometimes raised in temple households, trained in both the physical and spiritual management of birth. They knew how to cut an umbilical cord with a copper blade heated over fire. They knew which incantation to chant when the mother's pulse slowed, and they knew when the last breath had left the birthing room what to do with the body that remained. There are fragments of ritual texts that mention the bone rite, not in detail, but in passing. A line here, a phrase there. The wrist shall be cleaned, or the wall receives the left side. From these scraps, scholars have pieced together a possible sequence. When a woman died in childbirth, especially if she belonged to a household of status, her body was washed and anointed. A small part of it, usually a limb bone, was set aside, not buried, preserved, wrapped in linen, sometimes marked K, and eventually placed in the wall of the birthing room. An act not of denial, but of remembrance. It was not meant to disturb it, was meant to protect. One theory suggests these bone altars functioned like ancient talismans, protective objects infused with both sacred memory and symbolic power, like a ward against death. A bargain, perhaps. One life's gone, so another may come. A reminder that this room has seen both survival and loss, and that one must respect both. Some rooms bore tiny inscriptions near the shelves. Simple carvings, like "She labored" or "She is near." These weren't gravestones. They were almost like warnings, or blessings, or both. In one chamber, archaeologists discovered a clay tablet embedded above a bone cavity. On it were 6 small dots arranged in a vertical line, the ancient Sumerian symbol for past. No name, no date, just a direction: past, behind, gone, gone. But not absent. The practice may have also included ritual visits. One set of records from the early reign of Gudea mentions a month of return, where the midwives of the temple district made offerings to the silent watchers. These may have been the dead, but not the distant dead. The local dead, the remembered women in the wall, their bones sealed into the very room where birth continued. There is evidence that these rituals had meaning across generations. One chamber, excavated in 1992, showed signs of 3 successive reuses, each time repaired, replastered, repainted, but always preserving the bone shelf. No bones were removed. They were simply cluded. The room aged, and the dead remained. Over time, some shelves were expanded. What began as 1 bone became 2, then 4, then a full row. One room had 11 distinct long bones, lined up like books, all female, all placed with care. Who were they? Generations of midwives, or a lineage of loss? The answer is unclear, and perhaps that is the point. These bones were not meant for identification. They were meant for function. Bone as ritual, bone as warning, bone as quiet defiance against the chaos of childbirth. Midwifery in ancient Mesopotamia was often tied to the divine. The goddess Ninhursag, sometimes called the Lady of the Sacred Mountain, was believed to be the first midwife in the Sumerian myth of Enki and Ninhursag. She gives birth to 8 deities, heals injuries with her breath, and names children with her tongue. She is not a warrior. She is not a queen. She is a mother of gods, a midwife of gods. And so, to align midwives with this goddess was no small matter. Bone shelves may have been part of this alignment, a way of honoring the divine lineage of birthing work, a way of saying, we remember, we serve, we continue. There's one especially haunting inscription, found not in Lagash, but in a related Sumerian site nearby. On a small tablet fragment, likely written by a midwife or priestess, are the words, "She gave life to 2 and kept none. Her arm is in the clay. Her breath stays with us." It reads like a confession or a prayer. It reminds us that these women did not operate in detachment. They lived with the deaths, carried them, and when the next mother came in, screaming, sweating, desperate, the midwife's fingers would tremble just a little, because she had seen the wall. She had placed the last one there. She knew what was at stake. So the midwives built altars, not to be seen, but to be remembered. And in doing so, they created a history that lay just beneath the surface, not inscribed in king lists or victory hymns, pressed into clay, marked with soot, and left in the stillness between contractions. What remains, then, is not just architecture. It is grief made durable. And we ask, what does it mean to give your body to a wall that watches others survive what you could not? Asterisk. Over time, the birthing rooms of Lagash fell silent. The clay benches cracked. The pigment faded. Dust softened the outlines of what had once been shelves for memory. And in the stillness that followed the centuries, the walls remained. Bones stayed where they had been set, neatly, quietly, without ceremony, as if time itself knew not to disturb them. When the first modern archaeologists reached the site in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, had little understanding of what they were seeing. Bone fragments embedded in structural walls were considered debris or accidental inclusions. It was only after a closer examination, and later, after more careful female-centered excavation work, that a clearer story began to emerge. This was no accident. The bones had been placed there. Deliberately, they belonged exclusively to adult women, and always, without exception, they were found in rooms that showed evidence of birth: umbilical knives, warming stones, cradle fragments, pigment trays for body marking, even ceremonial cups for the offering of goat's milk or date wine. 2 new mothers. The patterns were too precise, too human, too intimate. Historians began reconstructing what daily life might have felt like in these rooms. Picture it: the scent of crushed date oil and damp clay, the heat of a fire kept low to warm water, the low chant of a midwife's breath prayer to Nintunuga, goddess of healing. Outside, the noise of oxen and dust carts. Inside, a breath held, a cry awaited, a body trembling, and in the corner of the room, a wall that remembered everyone who didn't make it. Some of the bones were smooth, polished by centuries of breathless heat. Others were cracked from ancient shifting, but still clearly aligned. One midwife's tablet, discovered near what had once been a temple-connected birthing chamber, included a ritual line not found in other sources. To touch the shelf is to promise silence. To add to it is to promise memory. That sentence, to promise memory, is where we linger now. These altars, if that is what they truly were, represented not just death, but continuity. They were part of a lineage of care. One midwife trained the next, who buried the next, who continued the ritual. There are few places in the ancient world where female professional memory lasted this long, and yet, here, it did. Bone as testimony, bone as mentorship, bone as quiet inheritance. Later records from nearby Amma and Adab suggest that the practice waned as temple authority changed, as childbirth became less associated with ritual and more confined to domestic corners. The walls no longer received bones. New birthing rooms were built without cavities. The altars became metaphor. The bodies were buried elsewhere, but in Lagash, for a brief stretch of time, perhaps only a few generations. The rooms where children entered the world were guarded by the remains of those who didn't leave it. One room, excavated only recently, contained the partial skeleton of a woman, set deep into the foundation beneath the birthing bench itself. Not just a limb, a full body, folded. The grave was carefully lined with ash and packed reed, a rare level of care for such a placement. Was this the first? The origin of the practice? Was she the last? The woman's pelvis had been crushed, possibly during a difficult labor. Her teeth showed signs of stress and calcium depletion, consistent with pregnancy. Her arms were bent inward, and a small bronze pen, like one used to hold a swaddling cloth, lay beneath her hand. No infant remains were found with her, only a sealed jar, empty. Perhaps the child survived, perhaps not, but she had been placed beneath the room as if to hold it up, a foundation of memory, a floor of grief, and above her, for a time, others were born. The room eventually fell out of use, replastered, reassigned, but never fully dismantled, as if no one quite knew what to do with her. And that's the heart of this story in the ancient city of Lagash. Midwives built more than families. Athea built ritual out of loss. Kay built memory into walls. They built a language that didn't use names or dates, chorus, praise, just placement. You cannot ask these women what they believed. You can only see what they left, not in books, not in myth, but in the structure of their rooms, in the silence of their shelves, in the line of bones pressed into cooling clay as the air settled after a scream. And maybe the final question isn't why they did this. Maybe it's why we forgot they did. Because once you've seen the shelves, it's hard to unsee them. Once you know, the room was built on memory. Every sound inside it feels like an echo. And once you realize that history holds more in its quiet corners than in its golden thrones, you start looking differently at the walls that surround you, especially when they don't say a word. Asterisk. In the heart of ancient Babylon, the famed city of hanging gardens, ziggurats, and 1,000 gates. There was a quiet wing, rarely spoken of in royal records. It sat far from the courtroom, past the scribes' chambers, and behind a series of low, columned corridors warmed by the sun. The walls here were simple. The floors, tiled in reed mat and fine dust. The air smelled of breast milk, smoke, and rose water, and the sounds were different too, not decrees or footsteps, but tiny hiccups, lullabies, and sometimes nothing at all. This was the nursery wing, not merely a room for mothers and infants, but a whole section of the palace designed to raise children born of power, royal babies, half-divine daughters, sons who might rule, and others whose names we never learned. What remains of it today is not much. Fragments of walls, outlines of sleeping pallets, some drain channels, but one detail stands out. The toys, or what we believe were toys. Dozens of them, found buried not in treasure rooms, but beneath the floors of Babylon's domestic chambers, especially in the women's quarters and nursery annexes. They were small, made of clay, dull, and strangely quiet. The clay dolls of Babylon were not like the toys of today. They had no smiling faces, no bright colors. Most were unpainted, shaped quickly by hand, sometimes pressed into simple molds. Many had large eyes and swollen bellies. Some wore flattened clay hats, others had tiny holes where earrings might once have dangled, and they were not buried with children. They were buried beneath the floors of rooms where children lived. This distinction matters. It suggests that the dolls weren't just toys. They were witnesses, or guardians, or offerings. Something more than playthings, something closer to a ward. In one room of the South Palace of Nebuchadnezzar II, a set of clay figures was found beneath a layer of crushed brick flooring. They had been carefully arranged, not scattered, placed in a circle. Each doll faced inward. In the center, a small piece of burned incense resin and a copper bead. No child remains were found in the room, no grave, but there were traces of milk and a carved inscription near the threshold that read, "The Room of Tears." What does it mean? We can't say for certain, but what we do know is this. Babylonian culture held complex beliefs about childhood, vulnerability, and the spirits that roamed between life and death. In particular, young children, especially royal ones, were seen as both sacred and susceptible, not yet tethered to the world, still floating between breath and divine fate. And so protection was layered, not just through ritual, but through material things like dolls, or rather, figurines. Historians now call them Pazuzu wards, though not all represented that spirit. Some were images of protective demons, like Lamassu, winged beasts with human faces. Others were caricatures of distracting spirits placed near children to lure evil away. If a demon saw a doll, the theory went, it might mistake it for the child and strike the clay instead. There's something chilling in that. A toy as decoy. A child protected by mimicry. A clay body given to save a breathing one. But there is also something deeply tender. A parent, perhaps a mother, perhaps a nurse, shaping a tiny body with her fingers, not out of joy, but out of dread, placing it beneath the floor where her child sleeps, whispering a prayer, stepping back, hoping, and waiting. Some dolls were shaped like animals, dogs, lions, birds, symbols of protection, courage, or freedom. One room in the Ishtar Gate complex had a floor cavity filled with 32 such figurines, all facing the same direction, all found beneath what appears to have been a chamber for breastfeeding and rest. This wasn't random. This was design. The dolls were part of the room, not for touch, for presence, in Babylonian omen texts. There are references to the watchers below, figures placed beneath foundations to stabilize luck or ward off misfortune, while many scholars apply this idea to building ceremonies or temple rituals. Others now believe it extended to domestic spaces, especially nurseries. In one recovered tablet, a priest writes, "The spirits of childhood are thin. They drift. They must be weighed down with form. Let the clay take their burden." That line, "let the clay take their burden," feels central to this practice. The dolls weren't amusements. They were containers, vessels to catch fear, pain, misfortune. Some were even shaped with exaggerated features, wide mouths, long fingers, protruding ears, visual distortions to attract malicious forces and pull them away from the child. Dolls, in short, suffered for the child. This is not metaphor. This is how they were made. And so, beneath the palace nurseries, dozens, perhaps hundreds of these figurines lay quietly, lined up, sealed into the dust, not labeled, not revered, just used and forgotten until the excavations began, and one by one, case surfaced, some with soot still on their faces, some with cracks from long-ago fire, some with fingernail impressions from the woman who shaped them 2,500 years ago. The nursery wing is no longer whole. Its walls are broken, its floors uneven, but the toys remain, not scattered in rooms of joy, buried in rooms of silence. And so we ask, when clay is shaped in fear and buried in hope, does it still count as a toy? Or does it become something else entirely? Asterisk in the dim corners of Babylon's nursery chambers, where the cries of royal infants once echoed in the slow tread of wet nurses pressed grooves into soft clay floors, there was a ritual that no one wrote down. Not the priests, not the scribes, not even the midwives, but the dolls remained. The more archaeologists uncovered these figurines, the clearer a quiet pattern emerged. They were not uniform, not mass-produced, not even symmetrical. Most were lopsided. Some had arms that stretched oddly forward. Others had heads that tilted unnaturally, as though bent to listen. Nearly all were unfinished at the back, flattened, as if never meant to be viewed from behind. That's because they were made to be seen. From one side only, from beneath, by the god's dot, or by the spirits that crept through cracks in the floor. Pulled upward by the warm scent of milk, breath, and sleep. Some dolls wore etched markings, a crescent for sign, the moon god, a jagged slash that might represent Nergal, god of the underworld. One doll bore a tiny triangle cut beneath the eye, a symbol associated with Lameshtu, the child snatcher. But the symbol wasn't a tribute, it was a trap. A trick. These were not devotional items, they were imitations, bait. Babylonian religion, like much of Mesopotamian theology, was not built on purity, it was built on negotiation. You didn't worship gods out of love, you bargained with them, appeased them, gave offerings to keep them at a distance. And in the nursery wing, where death came often and quickly, offerings weren't enough, so clay stood in. This is why some dolls appear deformed. It wasn't clumsiness. It was deliberate distortion, exaggerating features to confuse spirits. Some dolls had open mouths, but no eyes. Others had multiple eyes and no mouths. Some had arms reaching behind their backs. One strange figurine discovered near eastern wall of a nursery complex had a detachable head. This was not play. This was defense. The dolls were shaped to absorb misfortune, to act as substitutes in the eyes of spirits. If Lameshtu came crawling, let her take the clay baby. If a fever demon rose through the floor, let it enter the doll. It's a theology of displacement, a kind of magical accounting. You cannot stop misfortune, but you can divert it, redirect its gaze, trick it with shape and texture. The dolls became a middle ground between child and danger, and they were placed, always, below. Not in toy chests, not in hands, but beneath mats, behind wall seams, inside floor cavities. Quietly in one chamber, archaeologists found an entire box of unbaked figurines sealed in a clay vessel. Some were crumbled from age, others still soft to the touch, preserved by dryness and darkness. The vessel had been buried beneath the nursery floor, but showed no sign of ritual. It was simply placed. Was it storage? Or had they been forgotten? Or did the family leave in haste, abandoning the toys meant to protect? There's no answer, only the vessel, the figures, and the silence they kept. Some rooms revealed layers of dolls, one stratum containing a dozen figurines, another layer below with older styles, cruder designs. This suggests continuity. One generation followed another. One child was replaced by the next, but the dolls stayed. They were not removed when a child grew up. They were added to. Each layer deepened the room's protection. Each new doll became another watcher. And somewhere in the logic of Babylonian domestic belief, this layering mattered, because the more watchers there were, the more confused the evil became. No single child could be easily found. There was strength in ambiguity, but there was also fear, a quiet fear that pervaded every aspect of infancy in the ancient world. No guarantees, no vaccines, no safe births. Every breath might be the last. Every fever might end in silence. And so they fought it the only way they could, with shaped mud pressed by anxious fingers. Buried in rooms that never saw sunlight, the royal nursery was not immune to this. In fact, it may have been more vulnerable. A royal child meant lineage, legacy, power. And so the palace did what it could. Not just with prayers, but with dolls. And nearby, in rooms used by priestesses, other figurines were found, not of babies, but of gods. Or rather, of gods dying. Tiny clay figures representing deities in suffering. One with a broken staff, another with its head bowed. Still another, barely more than a lump of clay, stamped with the sign of Marduk, the chief god of Babylon, lying prone. What does this mean? One theory, these were sympathetic offerings, not prayers, but effigies. The idea was simple. If a god could be made to suffer in effigy, then perhaps the illness would pass over the child and strike the god instead. Another substitution. It's cruel, it's desperate, it's brilliant, it's faith shaped in clay, buried in silence, hoping not for blessing, but for absence. The nursery wing becomes something else. Not a place of joy, a battlefield, but the enemies are unseen, and the soldiers are dolls. So we ask, when a mother shapes a god in pain, Cain, buries it beneath her child's bed, is she still praying? Or has she learned that in Babylon, even the divine must kneel to grief? Asterisk, by the time Babylon reached its peak, when its towers cast shadows longer than its walls, and its name echoed from riverbanks to desert caravan trails, the rituals of its nursery wing had already begun to fade. The great kings still walked its halls, scribes still inked their tablets, priests still paced their temple platforms with eyes raised to the heavens. But in the back wings of those palaces, where the coos and coughs of infants once filled the silence, the clay dolls remained. They no longer had names. They may never have. But they were still there, still watching, still bearing witness. Over time, the floors were paved anew. Rooms were repurposed. New generations slept above the buried ones, unaware of what lay beneath. In one corner of a later palace annex, built during the reign of Nabonidus, Babylon's final king, a floor crack revealed a cavity packed with ash, resin, and 3 ancient dolls, crude, burnt, left as if in a hurry. Perhaps it was war, or plague, or just the swift, common tragedy of a child taken too fast. But the dolls had been placed anyway. Even at the end of an empire, one still remembered. This act of shaping something small to bear the weight of something vast may be among the oldest forms of human protection. We make objects, we press into them our fears, then we place them quietly where danger might pass, hoping the gesture is enough. hoping someone or something sees. And that's what makes the nursery wing so haunting. Not its silence, its precision. Each doll was made with intent, each burial with care, not random, not careless. These weren't just superstitions scattered across a dusty city. They were patterned, repeated, refined, passed down. Mothers taught daughters, nurses trained apprentices, priestesses whispered the rules of concealment, substitution, warding. In one recovered tablet, found near the Ishtar Gate and dated to the 6th century BCE. A priestess writes, "Hide the clay under the child, but give no name to it. Let it carry what must not be spoken. Let it carry, not the child, not the priest, the clay. These small figurines, sometimes shaped like gods, sometimes like babies, sometimes like neither, became containers for Babylon's deepest fear, the loss of a child before memory could even begin, because a child who died before walking or speaking could be forgotten, and forgetting to the Babylonians was worse than death. So the dolls were not just protection, they were insurance. Even if the child died, the doll remembered. It had seen, it had stood in the place of the child. It had taken some part of their presence into itself. That belief changes the room. It means that even an empty crib was never truly empty. Even a silent nursery held voices. Even a sealed floor had witnesses beneath it. And the more the dolls were studied, the more archaeologists noticed their patterns mirrored another tradition, the foundation figurines used in temples. In those sacred buildings, clay figures were buried at the corners, representing deities or priests meant to guard the structure. In the palace nurseries, the same logic applied. But it wasn't stone that needed guarding. It was breath. It was heartbeat. It was the flicker of a life that had only just begun. We forget, times, that in the ancient world, most children did not survive. In Mesopotamia, nearly half of all babies died before age 5. Illness, hunger, heat, insects, infection. The list was long. The defenses were few, but still, people tried. And that trying took the shape of dolls, crude, lopsided, silent. One final find, unearthed in a collapsed corridor near the presumed nursery wing, may explain more than any tablet ever could. Beneath layers of mud, brick, and reed pressed into the foundation stones, archaeologists uncovered a rectangular pit, just large enough for a child. No bones remained, no clothing, just one doll. Its face was blank, its arms wide, its surface coated in what appeared to be pigment, mixed with ash, the remnants of a fire. Had the child died, or had they fled? Or had the doll been offered in place of a child? We cannot know. But the pit was sealed, its bricks blackened, as if scorched deliberately. A ritual of substitution, an erasure, a preservation, depending on your view. And then, like all the others, it was buried. Centuries passed, and then the trials came, and then the silence broke, and suddenly, Babylon's children were not alone. Again, their dolls had kept watch, their fears had shaped, their guardians were made of earth. And even now, we ask, when fear is molded by hand and buried beneath a sleeping child, does the earth remember the shape? And if we press our ears to the floor, can we still hear the toys breathe? The city of Hattusa was built for permanence. High stone walls curved across the Anatolian hills, carved with lions and gods. Its streets ran straight. Its temples loomed in carefully squared courtyards. Even its royal seal, a double-headed eagle, seemed designed to outlast time. And for a while, it did. But nothing is truly permanent. Not kings, not walls, not even a child's cradle. Toward the northern wing of Hattusa's royal compound, near the edge of what is now a ragged ridge, overlooking ancient farmland, there sat a room. It was not large, The walls were plain, but the layout told a quiet story. Low benches around the sides, central hearth, a narrow doorway shielded from view. It wasn't a place for meetings. It was a place for recovery, for nursing, for sleep. And in the far corner of that chamber, archaeologists found a cradle base, just the base, asterisk. The rest had rotted, as all wooden things eventually do. But the outline was unmistakable, a rectangular depression in the clay floor, lined with a groove where frame legs once rested. Nearby, fragments of wood remained, birch or elm, possibly imported, and beneath the hollow, a cache of items, a bead, a lock of curled hair, and a tiny Hittite seal. Worn smooth, no tablet named the child, no record declared their birth, but from the placement, the layering, and the quiet importance given to the space, a theory took root. This child, whoever they were, mattered, perhaps not to history, but to someone. Hattusa, the 13th century BCE, was a place of precision and power. The Hittites controlled vast territories, forged treaties with Egypt, and kept their archives with obsessive care. They counted their chariots, measured their grain, tracked dreams, but babies were different. They were not written down until they survived. So we are left with silence, except, of course, for the cradle. The placement of a cradle in the north chamber is not unusual on its own. Many palace complexes had such spaces, but what followed, what accumulated around this particular hollow in the floor, is what drew attention, because as the years passed, layers were added. Fine dust, soot, broken pottery. Then, unexpectedly, a layer of ash, followed by nothing. Room was sealed, abandoned, and within a generation, the kingdom collapsed. This is not to say the cradle caused it, but something happened here, and it traces. The subtle archaeology of fear suggests that a single moment, private grief, may have left an echo that reached the throne. Let's go slowly. First, the hair, human, tightly coiled, reddish brown, preserved by dry air and time. Too fine to be from an adult. It's likely a child under 2 years. It's placed not randomly, but folded inside a bit of cloth that had long since disintegrated. Wrapped, tucked beneath the cradle's footprint. This was not refuse. This was ritual then. The bead, carnelian, pierced carefully. Common in amulets meant to guard children against illness, tied around the wrist. In some traditions, if a child died before their first birthday, the bead was kept as a marker, a symbol of their soul. Finally, the seal, worn down to near anonymity, but just enough remained to reveal its motif, a winged sun. In Hittite theology, the winged sun was not merely a symbol of power. It was life, breath, kingship itself. To place that seal beneath the cradle was to name the child as a promise, a future, a possibility, and perhaps that child was lost, as the ash layer seems to imply. The promise collapsed too. There is a fragmentary letter in the royal archives of Hattusa, dated to around this same period. It reads, in part, "The sun fell in the house, and none came to raise it. The chamber is closed. The sign is broken." Was it poetic? Was it literal? Or both? The chamber remained sealed. No reuse, no repaving, just abandonment in a palace where nearly every space was repurposed over time. Temples into offices, halls into granaries. This one remained untouched, not out of reverence, out of something else, contamination. There is precedent for this in Hittite law. Certain deaths required a cleansing ritual, especially those involving royal blood. A member of the king's household died in circumstances deemed spiritually dangerous. The space itself became impure. Sometimes it was burned. Sometimes it was buried. Sometimes it was simply left, and the north chamber was left. The fire was small, controlled, ashes layered gently. Not a destructive blaze, a ritual one, to close the room, to silence the space, and yet the cradle remained, and beneath it, tokens stayed. It is tempting to imagine a woman, mother, or nurse placing them there quietly after the others had gone. A bead for protection, a lock for memory, seal for breath, then stepping back, then sealing the door. No words, no witnesses, just air. The rest of the palace continued. Kings issued decrees, scribes filled shelves, but in the far north wing, a single room stayed still. And then, within a few short years, the empire began to falter. Trade routes thinned, grain yields fell, invasions from the west. The reasons for the collapse are many, but in the nursery wing, none of that mattered. The cradle was already empty, so we ask, when a kingdom prepares a room for a child, the child does not stay. What remains? And when silence is built into a wall, can it ever truly be forgotten? Asterisk, long after the collapse of the Hittite Empire, long after the scribes stopped carving dates and the palace fires turned cold, the north chamber of Hattusa's royal nursery wing remained closed, not just abandoned, sealed. Its doorway was plastered over, not once, but 3 separate times. 3 distinct layers of white limewash and crushed gypsum carefully applied over the wooden doorframe. So each new occupant of the palace, or what was left of it, felt the need to keep whatever was inside. When archaeologists uncovered the room in the mid-20th century, the surrounding halls were in ruins. Stone blocks had shifted. Roofs were gone. Most doors had collapsed under centuries of frost and silence, but this one doorway still held its shape. Sunken, yes, but undisturbed. They chipped at the plaster, expecting a storage space or forgotten archive. What they found was ash, fine, gray, and undisturbed, piled in the shallow contours of the floor, and beneath the ash, the imprint of a cradle. There was no child, no coffin, no inscription, only dust. And beneath that, it's the same small items mentioned before: the carnelian bead, the reddish hair, and the worn seal of the winged sun. The placement of these objects was not ceremonial in the traditional sense. No altar, no platform, just an absence, marked not by monuments, but by restraint. Someone chose not to speak, chose not to move the cradle, chose not to clear the space. Instead, they sealed it 3 times. That matters in Hittite ritual texts, particularly the Quetzalcoatl purification liturgies. There is mention of 3-fold sealing as a practice usually reserved for spaces tainted by divine wrath or cosmic imbalance. It's a place where something has gone so wrong, human hands cannot fix it. The room is to be closed, sealed once for the gods, once for the ancestors, and once for the earth, not destroyed, preserved. As a warning, the North Chamber fits this model. What happened inside it is unknown, right? Its treatment, its quiet, repeated sealing, suggests a loss too great for ritual to resolve. Perhaps the death of a royal child, perhaps a birth gone wrong, perhaps something else entirely. But something broke, and the room became a memory that no one wished to enter. In the layers just outside the chamber, archaeologists found other signs, faint but suggestive. Bits of cloth likely belonging to an infant, a small bronze charm carved with the image of Araniti, the Hittite sun goddess, and, strangely, a child's footprint pressed into drying plaster near the entrance. Frozen in time. The print is shallow, incomplete, like a child took a step, then stopped, turned back, or was carried away. We'll never know. What we do know is this: after the room was sealed, it was never used again. Not in later periods, not by squatters, not by animals. Even time, it seems, knew to step around it. The Hittite palace continued for a few more years. The bureaucracy limped on. Its letters were sent, treaties signed. But the empire was already unraveling. Climate change, internal strife, external invasions. But in the silence of the North Chamber, all of that fades, because what echoes there is not the fall of a kingdom, it's the fall of expectation. A cradle built for continuity and then left behind. One scholar, Professor Hatice Ganet Bagana, who studied the room in the 1980s, wrote, "It is as though the walls knew to hold their breath. Nothing in the chamber has settled, yet nothing has moved." She called it a listening room, a place where the absence was louder than the stone, and still the bead remained. Carnelian, worn dot, not valuable but specific, used throughout the Near East as a protective charm, believed to ward off fevers, ward away restless spirits, balance the heat of new breath. To find one buried beneath the cradle is to find a hope that no longer worked. Some say this bead was all the family could save, or all they chose to leave. Hattusa had many sacred objects, bronze idols, golden leaves, temple carvings, but none feel more sacred than this bead, wrapped in soil and silence, nestled in the floor of a room where history refused to speak. And then there's the seal, the winged sun, worn smooth by fingers, or time until the lines could barely be read. In a palace where kings were referred to as my son, the image was more than metaphor. It was identity. A child born into the royal family would be touched by the sun, expected to carry light forward. But this seal was buried, turned, face down in the dust. The symbolism is quiet, devastating. The sun didn't rise here, it was put away. There are no surviving records that link this room to the collapse of the Hittite Empire. But in the silence, in the refusal to speak, there is a kind of weight that cannot be explained through trade routes or battle maps. This room became untouchable, and sometimes the things a kingdom refuses to touch tell the clearest stories of all. So we ask, when a room is sealed to protect the world from its memory, what remains behind the door? And what happens to a kingdom when its cradle no longer holds a future? The final collapse of Hattusa did not happen in a single night. There was no grand sacking, no blaze that lit up the hills for miles, no heroic last stand of soldiers on the ramparts. It came, instead, the way drought does, slowly, in stages, with murmurs of trade routes broken, with temples running low on barley, with horses thinner than they used to be, and somewhere in the stone heart of the city, the North Chamber remained closed, still sealed, still untouched. By the time the outer regions of the Hittite Empire fell into rebellion, the palace had already begun its retreat inward. Fewer scribes, fewer ceremonies, less bronze. The archives of the capital began to thin. Royal letters stopped being answered. The empire shrank, not through war alone, but through quiet, a shrinking of voice. But the cradle still sat beneath the ashdod, and no one spoke of it, not even in the surviving prayers or dream rituals. Nothing mentions the child, Tit. Nothing names the mother, K. Not one tablet speaks of the fire or the closing of the door. And yet every person in that palace, from the chambermaids to the king's steward, must have known what had happened in the North Chamber. It is not hard to imagine that it became a place people passed quickly, that they looked away, that even those who no longer believed in omens crossed themselves quietly when walking by rooms to have memory. And this one had been shaped by grief and sealed by fear. What happens to a kingdom that buries its hopes? The answer may be in the next generation of records, or the lack thereof. It's the royal succession after the presumed death of the child in the cradle becomes murky. The line grows unclear. Its names are duplicated, erased, or scribbled over. One prince disappears. Another dies in the field. By the time the last Hittite ruler signs a treaty, his tone is desperate. Short sentences, unanswered pleas. The kingdom had lost something it could not name, and perhaps it began in that chamber, Or perhaps it ended there. Later inhabitants of the region, Phrygians, Syrians, early Greeks, occupied parts of the ruins. They built on top. They carved their own symbols. But no one, not a single group, ever reused the north chamber. It remained a void, and sometimes a void is more telling than a monument, because what had happened was more than personal. It had become structural. The child in the cradle, real or symbolic, had carried the weight of continuity, of kingship, of breath becoming lineage, and when that was lost, there was no script for how to proceed. And so, they simply moved around the grief, rebuilt elsewhere, rewrote history to begin again without explanation. The archaeologists, who later studied the room, wrote with clinical care. They documented measurements, wood, traces, bead composition. But when it came time to interpret, their language softened. Phrases like probable, symbolic function, and suggestive of ritual closure appear, because the truth is, no one wanted to say the obvious, that someone had left a cradle in the dirt, and the world had quietly fallen around it. We are not trained to see infancy as historical. Power is supposed to reside in generals, in kings, in architecture, but sometimes the most profound moments happen when the future dies before it can speak. And that is what the North Chamber became, not a tomb, but a stillbirth of empire. In later layers, centuries after the fall, pottery shards were found. Nearby, domestic items, nothing royal. Life had returned to the hill, but not to that room. A local legend, courted by an early 20th century ethnography, speaking to villagers near the ruins, speaks of a stone crib that curses what fills it. They didn't know the Hittite word for cradle, but they knew something had happened there. And that's how memory lives, not in libraries, but in ruins, and in the corners people don't walk through. So we ask, when a city forgets on purpose, and a cradle is left in dust, what does the silence grow into? A warning? A ghost? Or just hollow where breath once almost began? Asterisk, long before the myths of the Minotaur turned the palace at Knossos into a story of monsters and labyrinths, it was a place of light that filtered through high windows on two red painted columns, light that bounced from alabaster floors to the soft plaster of frescoed walls, light that entered the queen's chamber and fell gently onto baskets of linen, oil jars, and in one room, onto a cradle. This is where the story begins, not in the throne room or the bull courtyard, but in a quiet annex behind the women's apartments, a place historians only later identified as a nursery. There are no inscriptions to confirm it, no records, but the clues are there. A soft depression in the floor where a wooden frame once rocked, scorch marks from warming stones, traces of beeswax, perhaps from pacifiers or balm, and buried just below the polished stone tiles, something small, golden, and silent. A rattle, not of wood, not of clay, but a hollow sphere of bronze, leaked in gold. Inside, tiny beads, long oxidized into dust. No inscriptions, no mark of the artisan, just a toy. Or perhaps, not just, because the rattle was not found beside a child's remains, nor was it buried as part of a burial ritual. It had been deliberately placed beneath the corner of the nursery floor, sealed in plaster, surrounded by 4 small cups of cues, darkened olive oil, and a single strand of baby hair, coiled like thread inside a ceramic bead. It had not been dropped, it had been planted. And when that realization came, when archaeologists understood the care with which this object had been positioned, the tone of the room changed. This was not a lost item. This was a memory, buried by hand. Knossos, during the peak of the Minoan civilization around 1700 to 1400 BCE, was a palace, unlike others of the Bronze Age. It did not emphasize defense. There were no towering outer walls, no looming watchtowers. Instead, the palace expanded inward, like a living organism, growing, shifting, evolving. Rooms were built atop rooms. Stairs wound in unexpected directions, and deep within its wings were spaces for life to unfold. Bathing chambers, kitchens, workshops, and among them, a nursery wing. What made this one different was the presence of that rattle, a luxury object in a space where simplicity dominated. Most toys found in bronze age Crete were simple, baked clay animals, polished pebbles, wooden blocks. But this rattle was something else, carefully shaped, seamless, fitted with gold leaf so thin it would have torn with breath alone. Why place something so fragile beneath stone? And why in a room with no other luxury? Theories vary. Some believe it was a gift, a symbol of protection or fortune. Others think it was a sacrifice, not of life, but of memory. That something had happened in the nursery that required forgetting, or honoring, or both. The placement echoes a broader Minoan tradition of votive depositions, placing objects beneath thresholds, floors, or hearths as offerings to household deities. But those were usually small tokens, cups, pebbles, dried herbs, a rattle of gold. That was rare, especially when paired with the cups of oil and the single lock of infant hair. Taken together, the scene suggests a moment, perhaps a child's first birthday, perhaps a survival ritual, or perhaps death. In Minoan culture, rites for the very young were rarely recorded. Infancy was liminal. Children did not yet belong fully to the world. The gods might still take them back, And so, the rituals, the small, quiet ones, happened not in temples, but in corners, like this one. The rattle at once made sound, soft, shaking, light as wind against reeds. But when it was found, it was silent. Its contents had dissolved. Its surface was pitted with time. It had not been touched in over 3,000 years. And yet, when the archaeologists lifted it from the floor, they found something else, a faint groove around the stone where it had been placed, as if someone had traced it. A finger, a cloth, core, a tool. Not just berry prepared. There is something unsettling in that. Care, because it implies presence and intention, and love and loss. The cups of oil had hardened into black residue, sticky and thick. The ceramic bead was cracked, but the hair within still curled, preserved by oil, by air, by the pressure of time. A piece of someone too small to be named, now cradled by stone and earth. The room bore other signs. Faint soot near the ceiling, where a lamp once burned. Nail marks in the plaster, perhaps from hanging cloth or charms. But the rest was clean, almost unnaturally so. It looked like a place that had been tidied, then left, not abandoned, released. And that, perhaps, is the point. Nisus would fall not long after. Around 1450 BCE, the palace suffered a sudden catastrophe. Fire, earthquake, invasion. No one agrees, but the end came quickly. Rooms collapsed, frescoes darkened, storage jars split open across courtyards. But this room, it didn't burn, it was spared. And when the ash settled across the city, the gold leaf rattle remained underground, sealed in a cradle of oil and silence, waiting not for its owner, but for memory. So we ask, when the last sound in a room is a rattle placed beneath stone, who was it meant to calm? The child, the gods, or the grief? When archaeologists first charted the lower quarters of the Nasus palace, they did not expect to find a nursery. There were chambers for wine, rooms for feasting, shrines for gods, and corridors that curled and stretched like a body in sleep. But tucked into the eastern wing, behind a quiet corridor, was a narrow space, no more than 4 meters wide, with a smooth floor, plastered walls, and only one entrance. No throne, no altar, just the echo of a life that passed quietly. It was here, beneath the floor, that they found the rattle, and just as striking, they found no other gold in the room. No sign that this space belonged to royalty. No trace of treasure, except for the one object that no longer made sound. This detail has puzzled scholars for decades. Why place the most precious thing not in a temple, not with the dead, but in the dust beneath a nursery corner? The answer may lie in a type of Minoan ritual, so old and subtle, it rarely left a mark in stone. It was called theranosphorgia by later Greeks, a gift to the quiet earth. But in Minoan culture, the act was simpler: to place something small, sacred, and used beneath a threshold or floor was to create continuity, not just between generations, but between worlds. The underworld was not feared in Minoan theology. It was fertile, it was still, and placing a rattle, something once alive with sound, into the ground was not loss, it was offering. This would explain the cups of olive oil surrounding it. Oil in Minoan culture was not just food or fuel, it was spirit. It held memory. It preserved. 4 cups, aligned at the corners, mirrored the layout of a ceremonial table. 1 for each direction, 1 for each wish. Perhaps for breath, warmth, speech, and sleep, and the strand of hair coiled within the bead. This was more than memento. It was identity, a marker of personhood in a world that didn't always name its infants. To keep the hair was to keep the thread. A single curling memory woven into stone. Archaeologists found the rattle perfectly centered between these tokens. It had not been thrown. It had been placed, and that suggests intention. Perhaps a mother knelt there long ago when the sun was dipping over the terraced rooftops. Perhaps she whispered a name, or nothing at all. Just breath, just a pause, and placed the toy not into a hand, but into the earth. Not because the child would use it, but because the child had touched it, and that was enough. When you visit the ruins of Nisus today, much of what you see is reconstruction. Sir Arthur Evans, who excavated the site in the early 1900s, famously rebuilt entire rooms based on fragments and theory. Some believe he guessed too much. Others say he preserved what would otherwise be lost, but no part of the nursery was rebuilt. It remained too ambiguous, too quiet. There were no frescoes to restore, no columns to re-erect, only faint impressions on the floor. A child's ghost, drawn not in myth, but in dust. Still, something fascinating emerged from the surrounding architecture. In neighboring rooms, signs of careful reuse. Old walls repainted, floors recast, shrines updated, but the nursery never touched again. Even as Nisus grew and adapted, the small chamber with the gold leaf rattle remained sealed, not buried, not destroyed, just unentered. This too may have been ritual in Minoan belief, a space that has received a gift. To the underworld was considered full, not in a literal sense, but in a spiritual one. It had done its work. It had received memory. It could not be reused, and so the room remained, a sealed echo, a chamber, no longer for the living, but for the remembering. Later, as the Mycenaeans arrived, the hard-edged mainlanders who brought with them new gods and sharp hierarchies, many Minoan traditions were erased or absorbed. Temples were repurposed. Deities were renamed. But the gold rattle stayed because no one knew it was there, or if they did, they chose not to move it. That restraint, that unspoken agreement to let the dust keep its story, may be the most Minoan thing of all. A civilization that spoke not with monuments, but with placement, not with scripture, but with gesture, not with statues, but with toys. And so the question remains, was the rattle a gift, a grave, a goodbye, or something simpler, a hope that the world might remember a sound, even after its owner was gone? Asterisk, there's something strangely heavy about a toy that was never meant to be played with again. The gold leaf rattle buried beneath. The nursery floor at Nisus had been built to make sound. a soft jingle, like rain inside a hollow bronze leaf. But by the time it was uncovered, it had fallen silent for over 3,000 years. Its hollow interior was filled with oxidation and the fine collapse of what once were beads. No sound escaped when it was lifted, just stillness. And yet, it had been crafted to ring dot, to soothe dot, to reach out toward a child's hand and meet it in the air. But instead, it had been placed under stone, sealed, surrounded by offerings of oil, memory, and hair, and never touched again. Why? There's a word in ancient ritual language for this, though we only know it from later echoes in the Greek world. Apotropaic. It means to turn away. A gesture or an object meant to divert harm. In Minoan practice, there is no direct documentation of apotropaic rites, but their presence is inferred from the way figurines were buried, from the use of knots and spirals in sacred architecture, from the doors that led nowhere, and from toys like this. Rattle berry, not to please the gods, but to mislead them. If a spirit came seeking the child, let it find the toy. If misfortune hovered near the crib, let it follow the glint of gold into the ground instead. This was not superstition. This was strategy. A form of logic practiced in households where death came quickly and medicine meant prayer. Minoan mothers, priestesses, and midwives all understood this subtle art of redirection. A doll left beside a bed, a mirror angled just so, a rattle buried beneath a sleeping mat. All quiet defenses, not against soldiers, but against silence. It's a kind of silence that comes when a cry is expected, but never arrives. In the nursery, that silence still lingers. The floor where the cradle once stood is slightly sunken, not from collapse, but from pressure. Years of pacing, feet, rocking motion. Perhaps a wooden base, long since vanished. Beside it, marks of charring on the wall. Maybe from a hearth. Maybe from a lamp. And then the bead, the lock of hair, the oil, and the rattle. Each tells a part of the story, but not the whole. There is no tablet that explains why the rattle was buried. No record of the child who once grasped it, or the hand that placed it into the floor. But we can imagine the moment, because we have seen it in so many other places. The mother, kneeling, the lamp burning low, a few drops of oil poured onto the stone, the rattle held, turned once in her fingers, still warm from the child who no longer stirred, and then slowly placed down. One final sound, not from the rattle, but from the breath that left her lips. A sound not recorded, but remembered, because it happened in a room designed to hold sound. Not of politics, not of sacrifice, but of the daily, boring beauty of infancy. Laughter, crying, coughs, sighs, and when those sounds stopped, the room didn't forget. It became something else. The act of sealing the rattle may have served as a quiet funeral, not for a body, but for a future that was too short to unfold in many Minoan graves. Children are buried with cups or beads, rarely with toys. The implication is that toys belong to the living. But here, the logic reverses. The toy becomes the tomb, the symbol, not of play, but of presence. And when Nasus fell, sometime between 1450 and 1375 BCE, during an era of widespread destruction and transition, the nursery was left untouched. Earthquakes cracked walls. Fire rolled through storehouses, but the floor where the rattle lay held firm. No scorch marks, no debris, just dust, and beneath it, the sealed echo of a child's world. World that never truly began. One archaeologist described the find this way. It was like unwrapping a lullaby that no one had sung. And perhaps that is the most haunting part. The rattle had been made with purpose. Gold leaf, shaped with care. Bronze hammered thin. A tiny seam soldered with early precision. Not a casual gift. Not something forgotten, a crafted object designed to last, yet destined to be buried. It reminds us that ancient love was not less than ours, only quieter, more practical, more willing to work with the materials of the world, gold, dust, hair, oil, to speak where voices couldn't. And so we leave the nursery, not with an answer, but with a sound we never heard, a rattle buried before it could soothe, a cradle pressed into stone before it could rock again, and a question when a palace falls, and all that remains is a toy no child played with. What, exactly, has survived? Asterisk, the city of Persepolis was not meant to be hidden, carved into a mountainside in the highlands of Persia. It was designed as a spectacle, a place to make empires visible. Its staircases unfolded like ceremony. Its walls were etched with processions of tribute bearers, from Ethiopians to Scythians, each carved with exquisite detail. It was not a city of trade or war. It was a city of presence, of being seen, and yet, beneath the grandeur, beneath the gates and halls and tall-backed thrones, were the smallest things no one was meant to notice. Teeth, tiny teeth, asterisk, still sharp at the edges, still pearly in the clay, but tucked into the mortar of the interior walls of the royal women's quarters, set not in containers, not in jewelry, but in the mud brick itself, as if embedded during construction. This is not a metaphor. This is a real, physical fact. Baby teeth, human, small, and spaced irregularly, discovered during a detailed restoration survey of the northeast residential quarters of Persepolis in the late 1960s. They were first thought to be animal, but dental analysis, performed years later and almost accidentally, confirmed them as human, and not from adults, from children, from infants, toddlers, perhaps no older than 3, some with roots, some worn smooth, some still blood dark. Along the break, there were no notes, no inscriptions, but they were real, and they had been placed there on purpose. Persepolis, seat of the Achaemenid kings, built by Darius I and expanded by Xerxes and Artaxerxes, was not a place where accidents happened. Everything, every beam and stone and stair, was meticulously arranged. Its columns were measured by celestial angles, its reliefs adhered to rigid aesthetic codes. Its materials, cedar from Lebanon, stone from Elam, gold from Sogdia, were chosen with ritual as much as reason. So if baby teeth were pressed into walls, there was a reason. The most likely protection, but not spiritual protection in the abstract, dynastic protection. Persepolis was more than a city. It was a system, a place where the future of empire was forged, day by day, child by child. And nowhere was that more delicate than in the royal household. Dozens of children, born to queens, concubines, noble wives, all raised in labyrinthine chambers that today are little more than outlines in stone. These were the children who might one day rule, or marry a satrap, or vanish, and as they grew, each small milestone was observed carefully. One of those milestones, the loss of baby teeth, was both biological and symbolic. In Persian belief, drawn from older Zoroastrian traditions, teeth were markers of breath. Their emergence signaled life. Their loss, a transformation. And so, when a child's tooth fell out, it was not thrown away. It was placed, sometimes into fire, sometimes into water, but in Persepolis, into walls. Imagine it. A nursemaid wraps the tooth in cloth, carries it to the shaded halls. A stonemason is summoned. Mortars softened. The tooth is pressed into place, sealed with earth, touched with water. No inscription, no ritual chant, just a gesture and a record that doesn't speak. In later Persian texts, particularly in Thinkard fragments, there are passing references to tooth rights among royal families. One line reads, "The boy's crown is light until the tooth is taken. Another says, to wall the breath is to hold the bond. These are cryptic phrases, but in context, they suggest a belief that the baby tooth carried some part of the child's fate, a fragment of breath, or soul, or name. By embedding it in the walls of the royal quarters, the household may have hoped to anchor the child's life to the empire itself, to make the body part of the structure, to say, this child belongs here, will return here, is held here, theirs. Also, the matter of which walls the teeth were found in, not the outer gates, not the audience halls, but the women's wing, a quieter space, a place for birth, for feeding, for waiting, and in some rooms, more than one tooth was found, clustered, arranged, not scattered like lost objects, placed like offerings. There's no archaeological precedent for this in other Achaemenid sites. No similar finds in Susa, Ecbatana, or Pasargadae. Only Persepolis, only here, which raises the possibility that this was not a widespread tradition, but a local one, a family one, a gesture started by a single mother or nurse or stonemason, and then repeated, not because it was law, but because it felt right, because the wall was strong and the child was fragile, and perhaps putting one inside the other felt like safety. But there's another possibility, a darker one in some traditions, especially those carried eastward into Parthian and Sogdian folklore. Teeth were seen as vulnerable, a point through which spirits could re-enter. A child who lost a tooth might become susceptible to misfortune, unless the tooth was destroyed or sealed. So sealing it into a wall behind stone, beneath lime, became a kind of quarantine. Keep the tooth safe, keep the child safe, keep the empire safe. It's an elegant logic, and an eerie one, because these weren't commoners. Teeth, the placement within the queen's wing suggests lineage, and the walls, thick and carefully smoothed, were never disturbed, not even by the fires that came later. Persepolis burned in 330 BCE, when Alexander the Great took the city in a drunken vengeance, or so the story goes. Its wooden beams blackened, its gold was looted, its columns cracked, but the walls of the women's wing, scorched on the outside, intact on the inside, and the teeth remained unbroken, still pressed into the clay. So we ask, when the smallest part of a child is buried in the bones of a palace, is that memory, or is it hope, or something between? The faint trace of a future so fragile, even breath couldn't hold it. Asterisk, the palace of Persepolis was a monument to stability. Every hall, every terrace, every stairwell was constructed to say the same thing. This is what power looks like when it does not fear time, but within those carefully cut stones. In the softest part of the palace, the women's apartments, tucked behind the main audience halls, was a quiet contradiction, a fragility, not carved in relief or sealed with royal inscriptions, but placed deep within the walls. Royal baby teeth. More than one, more than 10, found carefully set into the clay mortar that joined brick to brick, high on the interior walls, where only the hands of masons would have worked. This placement tells us something important. The act was private, not for ceremony, not for witnesses, not for public reverence, but for the wall, for the stone, for the place, which means the gesture wasn't meant to be seen, only to be known. One archaeologist described it as an architecture of intention, that is, the inclusion of objects, not to decorate, but to bind, to seal a wish into the structure itself. In this case, the wish was likely for continuity. A baby's tooth, fallen naturally, marked a transition, the movement from infancy to childhood, from dependency to individuality. In Achaemenid culture, a child who reached this point, especially a royal child, was one step closer to being useful to the state, a possible future general, a future queen, link in the dynastic chain. But before that, They were breath, potential, and vulnerable. The women of the palace, queens, concubines, sisters, and the nurses and servants who lived with them bore the burden of ensuring that potential survived long enough to matter. And in a palace built for eternity, they reached for one of the oldest tools of protection: burial, not of the child, of the parts the child left behind. By sealing a baby's tooth into the wall of the royal nursery, they bound the child to the palace, to the lineage, to the permanence of the empire itself. If the child grew and ruled, the wall remembered. If the child died, the wall kept something real, a kind of substitution, a kind of immortality. This practice is echoed faintly in Zoroastrian ritual texts, though those were written centuries later. In one fragment of the Bundahishan, an ancient cosmological document, it says, "That which falls from the body must be given to the stone, so that it does not return to the wind." Most interpret this to mean nails, hair, or blood. But in Persepolis, it might also mean teeth, and not just any teeth. The first teeth, in traditional Persian folklore, passed through generations, far beyond the fall of the Achaemenids. The first tooth of a royal child was often called the crown tooth, a small superstition, perhaps, but a meaningful one. To lose it was to enter the age of will, of speech, of memory, which may be why the placement of these teeth wasn't random. Many were found high in the mortar, near lintels, window edges, or the top corners of a chamber. Always up, always above the reach of a child, or anyone inside the room, as if to guard, as if to crown. And sometimes, clustered one wall had 5 teeth, aligned like stars, another 8. Near what might have been a nursing space, marked by ceramic vessels used for heating milk or porridge. These weren't buried to forget. They were embedded to remain, to endure. One theory even suggests that the teeth were placed during construction, that masons were instructed to leave spaces in the mortar for offerings. This would imply foresight, that the walls were built not just to support weight, not to hold lives. That would make the walls more than walls. They would be archives of breath, of lineage, of grief, but also, this cannot be ignored, of hope, because you don't place a tooth into a wall unless you believe the child will grow, will return to that wall, will run their hand across the stones and never know what's inside them. But someone knew, likely a nurse, perhaps the mother, in one preserved administrative tablet from Persepolis. The royal steward lists cloth and grain allocations for nurses of the second year. Gaddis, caregivers, 2 children who had survived infancy. At that stage, teeth would begin to fall. And so, perhaps, it was those nurses, not the queens, who carried the tiny crowns to the masons, who whispered names that never entered history. One tooth, found in a crack between stones, was wrapped in linen. Traces of red pigment marked the cloth, cinnabar, maybe dot or ochre, not decoration, marking, asterisk, a gesture of reverence, not celebration. And now, we know it remained there through the fall of the empire, through the fire that Alexander set, through the crumbling of roofs and the drying of wells. Small, forgotten anchors in walls built to last longer than any empire could not. So we ask, when the body outgrows the palace, and the crown is passed from hand to hand, does the tooth still hold power? Is memory strongest when it is sealed in silence, waiting, not to be found, but simply to remain? Asterisk, by the time Alexander stood beneath the high columns of Persepolis in 330 BCE, the city was already a whisper of what it had intended to be. The ceremonial staircases still gleamed, dapira of dignitaries still paraded along the stone walls, but the palace was quiet, not dead, not yet, but resting, waiting. And beneath all of that grandeur, in the cool, shadowed quarters of the women's wing, the teeth remained in place, small, overlooked, set between blocks of plastered clay, sealed in mortar and dust. They were not trophies. They were not marked. They were never meant to be discovered, but they endured. When the palace burned, whether by accident, drunken revenge, or deliberate destruction, the fire spread quickly through the cedar beams, the textiles, the wood-lined chambers. Ash settled like a second skin across the reliefs. Roofs collapsed, and yet the women's quarters did not burn fully. The rooms where the teeth were found showed scorch along the floor edges, but the walls stood, still lined, still intact, still holding the smallest pieces of empire, because these teeth weren't just relics of children, okay? They were extensions of the Achaemenid state, bits of breath and body placed inside the structure that claimed to be eternal. What Alexander took in gold, the walls kept in silence. That silence endured for millennia, until, in the late 1960s, conservationists working to stabilize parts of the palace noticed anomalies in the wall mortar of certain interior chambers. Small discolorations, inclusions, a few tiny, ill fragments that didn't match the stone. They were cataloged, bagged, assumed to be animal. It wasn't until years later, almost by accident, during a broader study of human remains in Achaemenid contexts, that the samples were re-examined and the truth surfaced. They were teeth, human, deciduous, each no longer than a lentil, their roots eroded, the enamel worn faintly, unmistakably human and young. Teeth lost between the ages of 5 and 2. Teeth lost between the ages of 5 and 7. Experts identified at least 20 distinct specimens in a narrow band of wall, some grouped, some solitary. Too many to be coincidence, carefully placed to be waste. It was a ritual, a hidden one, and one seen. It could not be unseen. Not just a city of columns and tribute processions, a city that remembered its children with plaster, that built hope into the seams of its bedrooms, that kept breath not in legend, but in molar and incisor. There are still no inscriptions to confirm this. No documents say, "Today I place my child's tooth into the wall," but that is the nature of quiet rituals. They pass not through writing, but through repetition. A nurse tells another nurse. A stonemason passes it to his apprentice. A mother touches the wall and remembers which stone holds her daughter's first lost tooth. And so the tradition grows not as policy, as care. And care is the one thing empires rarely preserve. They preserve war, they preserve wealth, they preserve names. But care, the slow acts of maintenance, the daily efforts to keep someone alive, that vanishes first, unless it's placed in a wall and forgotten deliberately. Persepolis was built as a performance, a city to impress visiting kings, to stage ceremonies, to embody order. But in the quietest part of its design, it allowed for disorder, for the unpredictable, for the fall of teeth and the rise of breath. In this way, the palace was not just a symbol of power. It was a vessel of memory. It carried the weight of its children, not in song, but in architecture. And though the empire crumbled, and the fire came, and the looters came, and time buried it all in wind and dust, the teeth stayed unburned, unmoved, waiting. Which leaves us with a final question. When memory is placed where no one will look, does it fade? Or does it become stronger, hardened by time, sharpened by stone, until someone finds it again, and finally understands that the smallest parts of a person once seen is worth saving? Asterisk, in the layered heat of southwestern Iran, the ancient city of Susa once pulsed with administrative breath. It was not a city of myth, but of paper, or more accurately, clay. Bureaucrats sat behind low tables and pressed their reeds into damp tablets, recording grain counts, livestock deliveries, linen inventories, and birth records. Hundreds of them, simple lines. A child of the household was born. The house received 1 unit of milk, or one gave. These women were wet nurses, most unnamed, most unseen, and yet, for centuries, they were among the most vital members of the royal households in Susa. Their role wasn't ceremonial, it was functional. They fed the heirs of empire when mothers couldn't or wouldn't, and then they vanished. From history, from writing, from the walls. Only through accident do they reappear. Through receipts, through milk rations, through the whispering lines of clay tablets once thought to dull the catalog. But dullness is where the real life of empires survives, in the quiet things, in the boring history of breath. Susa was a city of many empires. Elamite, Achaemenid, Seleucid, Parthian. Each wave left its layers in the mud brick, But in every one of those layers, a small class of women emerges again and again. Women assigned no lineage, but tasked with feeding the most fragile bodies the city had to offer. The children of rulers, of generals, of the priesthood. They were called gudu in early Elamite inscriptions, a term that meant to give from the body. Later, in Old Persian and Aramaic texts, they appear simply as those who nursed. A job, not an identity. But there is something revealing in how they are measured, not by name, by volume. Some tablets list rations for wet nurses, 3 liters of barley, beer per 10-day cycle, cut of goat, wool, oil, and always water. Wet nurses needed hydration constantly. It was known. And when the baby died, the milk dried, or the family shifted alliances, the entry stopped. Just stopped. No exit note, no farewell, only the end of milk. And yet, archaeologists began noticing something odd in several residences of Susa's administrative district, especially in the Elamite quarters, dated to around 1400 BCE rooms with 2 sleeping platforms, 2 sets of small bowls, and in some cases, remains of plastered clay figures, soft, smooth, barely shaped. Not idols, not toys, but vaguely human, female, holding something at the chest. These were not religious. They were not for display. They were functional, placed in corners, near beds, in some cases, embedded in walls, and always near the nursery rooms. One theory, they represented the wet nurse, not as worship, as remembrance, because the actual women, the ones who carried the child, fed the child, soothed the child at midnight, were rarely recorded in the family line. Their own children were often sent away, their own names omitted. They were present every hour, and yet never seen again once the child could eat from a bowl, except, perhaps, in clay soft, unpainted. A figure placed behind the child's sleeping mat, a gesture, thank you, that the scribes never copied. These figurines were sometimes found alongside milk residue, faint traces absorbed into the unglazed bowl nearby. Some had small impressions on their chests, as if a thumb had pressed in deliberately before the clay dried. A mark, a sign, not of ownership, of presence. One excavation in the early 2000s revealed a rare tablet that seemed to record the replacement of a wet nurse. The entry was brief. The woman was removed. A new one brought. No name, just function. Says functioning a pot, but in the same residence, a niche in the wall held a ceramic bead, worn smooth. Inside the bead, a hair dot, dark, curled, tested, female dot 2. Old to belong to a child, too fragile to come from a man. It may have belonged to her. The woman removed, kept not by the scribes, by the family, hidden in the wall. A token that meant something the empire did not know how to describe. Love, guilt, memory, cannot know, but it was not discarded. That is enough. Over time, the city of Susa turned to ruin. Empires moved east, then west. Roads shifted, its names changed. But the clay tablets stayed buried, and when they rose again, through digging, through accidents, through slow cataloging in museums no one visits, the women re-emerged, still unnamed, still measured in liters, still waiting. So we ask, when milk feeds a future king, but the hands that gave it are forgotten, what part of that king still belongs to her? And if she held him once, is that not a kind of rule? Asterisk, in the central archives of Susa, tablets were stacked like bricks. Some bore records of land transfers or grain loans. Others cataloged marriages, legal disputes, inheritances. Most were dull, beautifully dull. It's a slow heartbeat of an empire that loved to count. But tucked among these were the nursing contracts, small, routine, not easily missed. They read like this: a child has been placed with a woman of milk. She shall give until the tooth 1 jar of beer, 1 tunic, 2 lengths of thread, simple, impersonal, binding. In these lines, there is no mention of affection, no detail of lullabies, of the hand that brushed hair, of the sleepless nights. The tablet ends, the seal is pressed. The nurse becomes part of the household for a year, sometimes 2. Asterisk. Then the contract ends. The child weaned, the nurse released. Sometimes another nurse replaces her, sometimes not. Either way, her name, if it appears at all, vanishes. And yet, in the homes themselves, her presence lingers. In a row house, in the administrative district, known as House MZ13, by archaeologists, a pair of clay figurines was found embedded in the threshold of a sleeping room. Both female, one cradled something at the breast. The other, seated, held nothing, but their faces were worn smooth from touch. Not erosion touch. The kind of wear that comes when a thumb passes the same spot again and again, perhaps by a mother, or a child, or the nurse herself. No tablet mentions this house. No name is attached, but in the plaster of one corner, a faint imprint, a flower pressed into the wet surface, likely with a wooden stamp. A small personal decoration, the only one in the home. In Susa, flowers were not symbols of beauty. They were markers of private space. To mark a wall with a flower was to say, someone lived here, not just worked. Lived, and suddenly, the figurines are no longer ritual. They are presence. The woman who wasn't written down was remembered in the wall. The wall remembered. Across Susa, similar traces emerged: fragments of bowls with milk residue in secondary rooms, beds smaller than standard, an extra pair of sandals tucked into corners. No shrine, no grave. Function, pressed so deeply into daily life that the scribes looked past it. But the clay did in single quotes in later Elamite texts. Dating around 1100 BCE, there is a curious shift. Nursing women begin to appear with new titles: holder of the breath, the first hand, the woman who kept, not many, not often, but there, buried in tablets about palace renovations and winter grain stores. A line appears: the child of the house slept with the keeper and drank. The child lived. It's not poetry, but it's something else, an acknowledgement, and it might be the closest we get to a memory that was otherwise erased. We tend to think of memory as what is carved in stone, but the story of the wet nurses of Susa is written in routine. The same bowl washed, the same lips fed, the same child soothed through fever, and then gone, weaned, wedded, crowned, pod. Always beginning in someone else's arms. One excavated room, perhaps once used as a nursery, had a low shelf carved into its plaster wall. Within that shelf, a chipped cup turned upside down, and beneath it, a curl of linen wrapped around a single tooth, too small to be adult, and beside it, a bead, worn, fired, clay, red. The items weren't buried. They were tucked, not displayed, kept, perhaps, by the nurse, perhaps by the child, grown just enough to know what it meant to lose something. Either way, survived, not in text, in gesture. The woman's name, again, is missing, but her work is not. It's there in the rounded bowls, the extra cloth, the reed mat pressed flatter than the others. It's there in the milk-fat residue trapped in pot seams, in the heat stones by the fire used to warm hands before holding, and it's there, too, in what was never said, the unspoken contract, love that doesn't expect, gratitude, care without lineage, bond without title. So we ask, when an empire remembers only its kings, but survives only through its women, who truly built the state? And if a wet nurse holds a prince before he holds a scepter, is her touch not the first act of rule? Asterisk, there is a phrase that appears, briefly, in a badly damaged administrative tablet from Susa's Middle Elamite period. Atita is not part of a law or a ritual, but a simple delivery note for provisions. One jug of milk for the child of the court, given through her. Through her. That's all, no name, no title, not even the word nurse, just her. As though everyone already knew who that meant, as though her presence required no clarification, because in the palaces and courtyards of Susa, her body had already become part of the household's rhythm. Her breath, her warmth, her arms borrowed without record, returned without thanks, but not always without memory. In the smallest rooms, the backs of the grand residences, in the dim-lit corners where sleeping mats lay near cooking pots and cradles made of woven reed, the wet nurse left marks, not formal, not grand, but tactile. Lived one such room, excavated in 1993, revealed a series of shallow handprints pressed into the outer wall near the fire pit, for adult hands, too child-sized. Their spacing suggests a ritual, or at least repetition, perhaps a family, or perhaps the woman and the children she cared for. The prints were not decorative. They were private. No one who walked the outer courtyards would ever see them, but she saw them. She pressed them, and now, so do we. In another structure, known only as House 17, archaeologists found a smooth clay slab embedded in a wall near a storage alcove. It bore no carving, no glaze, just a faint depression. Analysis suggested it had once been damp leather, perhaps a satchel, pressed accidentally or left deliberately inside the alcove. Its feeding bowls, unusually shallow, a small scoop, likely, carved from bone, and a cup rimmed with fine soot, lip level blackened from being warmed too many times over too weak a flame. None of this proves anything, but together, reads like presence, not a statue, not a stele, but the real architecture of caregiving. The thing about wet nurses, especially in ancient Susa, is that they had no families of their own within the palace. They were temporary, in function, not in effort. They could be dismissed, exchanged, paid, and forgotten. But the children we fed could not forget, because milk makes memory, not in the brain, in the body. There's a story, fragmentary told, in a much later Parthian text, possibly adapted from older Elamite traditions. It tells of a boy born into a royal line who is frail, weak, silent. His mother refuses to nurse him, fearing he will not survive. A woman is summoned. She feeds him, holds him. The mother takes him back. The woman is dismissed. Years pass. The boy becomes king, and though he does not remember her name, he cannot bear to sleep without the scent of barley and rose oil. The scent of her hair. It's apocryphal. It's quiet, but it speaks a truth the records rarely did, that the early nourishment of the body, the skin-to-skin moment between nurse and child, lives longer than any decree. That kingdoms begin not with oaths, but with eyelids fluttering open to the light of a borrowed chest, a borrowed voice, a borrowed heart. In the ruins of Susa, nothing remains of the nurses' bodies. No graves, no epitaphs, but in the clay, there are bowls. There are figurines. There are traces of milk, and in one extraordinary find, beneath the cracked floor of a late Elamite storage room, a set of personal items was uncovered. A worn sandal, a hairpin carved with floral spirals, and a ceramic whistle in the shape of a dove. too fine for a servant, too personal for tribute, too humble for royalty. The whistle, when cleaned, produced no sound. It had cracked along the spine, but someone had once shaped it. Someone had held it close, perhaps to make a child laugh, perhaps to call them from across the mat, perhaps to comfort herself when no one else would. The breath that passed through that toy did not survive, but the mark of its passing did. And that is the story of the wet nurses of Susa. They lived where ink did not reach. They gave where gold did not shine. They made children into kings. End when their milk was no longer needed. They left behind only touch, not in the record, in the room, in the corner, in the dust. So we ask, when the body is forgotten, died, does the breath she gave still linger? And if so, how many empires have been built on milk that no one recorded? Asterisk, in the great palaces of ancient Egypt, where limestone floors gleamed under sandals laced in gold, and the air hung heavy with myrrh and bureaucracy. Not every room had a name. The audience chambers did. The offering rooms did. The halls of birth and blessing did. But somewhere behind the women's apartments, deeper, smaller, and quieter, there was always a room with no official function, no inscriptions on the walls, no decorations, no obvious purpose, just an echo. The early Egyptologists called them transition spaces or storage chambers. But the locals, who guided the excavations, men who had heard their grandmothers whisper stories beneath the mud brick homes along the Nile, had a different word. They called them Bit el Baka, the weeping rooms, crying chambers, places where women went when the walls could not hear them. The term is not found in hieroglyphs, but it is remembered. In the rooms still exist. Asterisk, at least a dozen have been uncovered across royal compounds from the Middle Kingdom through the late Ptolemaic period, in Thebes, in Amarna, in Memphis. Always the same structure: a narrow door, a low ceiling, no light source, no ventilation, and usually some object left behind: a cloth, a broken amulet, a bead, and sometimes nothing at all, just stillness, hardened into plaster. One such room, found in the ruins of a royal residence near Deir el-Bahari, was no more than 6 feet wide. The walls were plain, unfinished mud plaster, still bearing the prints of fingers that once smoothed it. The floor was coated in a layer of fine dust and crushed shell. Asterisk, but in the corner, a hollow dot, deliberate dot, shaped like a sitting space, as if someone had curled their knees to chest for a long time. And beside it, under layers of ancient dust, a ceramic bowl, empty, worn, asterisk,